Okay, let's unpack this. If you're tracking global biodiversity crises, you definitely know freshwater environments are, well, massive hotspots. But they're also absolutely under siege.
Mm-hmm.
We routinely discuss pollution, habitat loss, all factors driving a pretty substantial decline in freshwater fish diversity globally.
Yeah, the pressures are immense.
But one of the most insidious threats, and maybe the most complex to manage, is the invasive species we intentionally or accidentally introduce.
That's right. And that complexity is exactly what we're digging into today. For this deep dive, we looked at a really critical review paper. It's titled Contemporary Perspectives on the Ecological Impacts of Invasive Freshwater Fishes, led by John Robert Britton.
Okay.
And our mission for you, the listener, is basically to synthesize the current understanding of invasion ecology. We want to move beyond just identifying the bad actors,
Right, beyond just pointing fingers.
Exactly, to really defining and crucially quantifying the actual harm they inflict on these delicate systems.
Because the simple truth is, while the number of non-native fish introductions is shooting up globally, aquaculture, the pet trade, sport stocking, all that,
Yeah, it's coming from everywhere.
most of those introduced species actually fail to become disruptive. We hear about the classic tens rule, right? Only a tiny fraction actually makes that jump from just being introduced to becoming a destructive invader.
Precisely. So the foundational question the paper tackles is, what combination of factors allows those few species to make that leap?
What's the magic formula, so to speak?
If only it were that simple. The authors stress it involves multiple processes: competition, predation, disease, and these effects, they rarely act in isolation. They often work together, additively, or even synergistically, creating this highly dynamic, often unpredictable picture.
Okay, so let's start right at the beginning then. What actually has to happen for an introduced fish to successfully establish itself and, actually gain a foothold? What makes a species succeed in a place that isn't its home turf?
Well, the variables fall into roughly three main baskets, starting with the species itself. What traits does it bring to the table?
Like its biological toolkit.
Exactly. There's the classic adaptation hypothesis. This suggests the fish might already possess traits like specific life history characteristics or, say, thermal preferences that are basically pre-adapted to the new environment. It allows for rapid establishment.
So it's like showing up with the right key for the lock already.
Pretty much. You can think of it as finding a near-perfect niche almost immediately.
But I imagine it's not always about being perfectly pre-adapted. Sometimes they have to change their game plan to win, right?
That's the critical contrast. Sometimes a successful invader needs to exhibit phenotypic plasticity, that's the ability to rapidly modify its own traits,
Ah, okay.
to gain an ecological advantage over a new set of competitors or predators it encounters. It's the difference between finding that perfect tool, like you said, and successfully modifying the tool you actually brought with you.
Got
A major advantage they often do bring, though, is something called enemy release. They arrive without their native parasites and predators,
Right, less baggage.
which frees up a lot of energy for growth and reproduction.
That makes perfect sense. They're kind of running lighter, ecologically speaking, but does that advantage last forever?
Not always. That benefit can be countered by parasite acquisition, where native parasites actually manage to host switch onto the new arrival.
Ah,
But generally, yeah, enemy release provides a huge initial boost.
okay, so beyond the species traits, how much does the act of introduction itself matter? Is it simply a numbers game? More fish means more success.
It is, but in a more quantified way than just more is better. This is where we talk about propagular pressure.
Propagular pressure, okay.
Yeah, this term refers to both the size, so the number of individuals released at once, and the number, meaning the frequency, of introduction events.
Right.
What's really fascinating is that the relationship between this pressure and eventual establishment, it's highly nonlinear.
It's nonlinear?
Yeah.
So it's not just a slow, steady increase in success the more fish you introduce. It suggests there's like a sudden acceleration point,
Yeah.
a threshold.
Exactly. Empirical evidence points to a sharp threshold of propagule size. Once you cross that minimum genetic and demographic threshold, the chances of establishment and developing a highly abundant invasive population become exponentially more likely.
Right.
If a population establishes below that threshold, it often suffers from low genetic diversity, inbreeding depression, that kind of thing, and just fails to sustain itself long term.
Makes sense. And finally, the receiving environment itself must play a massive role. The two competing ideas here are quite interesting. You have the biotic resistance hypothesis,
Hmm.
which suggests a healthy, species-rich native community should actually resist invasion because of strong existing competition or predation pressure.
That's the system's own natural defense mechanism, you could say. The paper notes, for instance, how predation from native common carp and perch can sometimes suppress the highly invasive topmouth gudgeon. But then you have the opposing concept, the disturbance hypothesis, which argues that ecosystems already highly modified or stressed by human activity are actually the most vulnerable.
And this is where the human element really, well, creates the vulnerability, opens the door.
Absolutely. The data on human disturbance, especially things like riverine impoundments, reservoirs created by dams, is staggering.
How so?
Well, these altered systems tend to favor non-native generalist species over the native specialists, often because the flow patterns and temperature regimes have been completely changed from what the natives evolved with.
And this isn't a small difference we're talking about.
Not at all. The research highlighted shows the likelihood of finding non-indigenous species in these impounded rivers is up to 300 times higher than in comparable natural lakes.
300 times. Wow.
Yeah. The infrastructure we build, often for energy or water supply, can effectively become a superhighway for these invasives.
So if we connect this to broader applications, it really suggests that managing our own disturbances, like controlling flow alteration or pollution, is probably the first prerequisite for any successful long-term invasion prevention.
You've hit the nail on the head. It's about protecting the native system's integrity first.
Okay, so we understand better how they get a foothold. But what happens once they are established? What weapons are actually in their invasive toolkit? We typically jump immediately to thinking about competition and predation.
And those are certainly key mechanisms, no doubt, but it's nuanced. While competition definitely occurs, especially, when a resource is clearly limited, what stable isotope analyses have often shown is something quite interesting. A pattern of trophic niche divergence. Meaning, instead of native and non-native species directly fighting tooth and nail over the exact same food item, the invader often exploits previously underutilized prey or resources. They find a slightly different niche.
Huh. So rather than competing head-to-head all the time, the invader sometimes just sort of expands the food web's total reach, maybe facilitating a temporary coexistence?
Precisely. It can happen that way, at least initially. However, predation remains a far more direct and often destructive process. When a non-native piscivore, a fish eater, is introduced, severe predation frequently drives rapid, really destructive community changes.
And there are examples of this.
Oh, the paper provides some crushing examples, like the introduction of largemouth bass in Zimbabwe. It reduced the abundance of some stream-dwelling barbus species by a staggering 99%.
99%?
Yeah. Or, of course, the infamous case of Nile perch in Lake Victoria, which led to massive extinctions. Predation can be swift and devastating.
Right. Okay, shifting away from eating and competing, the next mechanism you mentioned is often more silent, maybe, but potentially devastating to long-term biodiversity: genetic introgression.
Yes, this is the permanent blurring of species lines. It's a huge conservation concern. When non-native fish are released and they find taxonomically similar native species nearby, they can hybridize.
They interbreed.
Exactly. The paper highlights the European barbel introduced into Italy. These invaders have introgressed so heavily with the endemic, the native Italian barbus species, that pure endemic populations are now actually facing extirpation-localized extinction.
And the hybrid forms themselves are often more successful, aren't they? Which just makes it worse.
They often are, yeah, which really compounds the problem. These hybrids can exhibit altered traits, like achieving larger sizes for their age, giving them a significant competitive advantage over the pure native forms. It accelerates the loss.
And perhaps the most, frightening tool in this invasive toolkit is disease transmission. Because this mechanism shows that sometimes the invader doesn't even need to be super abundant to cause mass harm.
This is a crucial non-trophic impact, absolutely. Consider the example given of the cyprinid topmouth gudgeon, Pseudorisbora parva. This small fish acts as a healthy, asymptomatic reservoir host.
A carrier?
A carrier, exactly, for a lethal pathogen called Sphaerithecum destruens. Now, when that pathogen gets transmitted to naive native fish populations,
The ones that haven't encountered it before.
right, it causes mass mortality events.
And the invader gets to carry the biological bomb, so to speak, without it going off on them.
Correct. And what's particularly disturbing for management, and this is a key finding, is that the pathogen can persist in the environment and within the native community, even if the invasive gudgeon host has been entirely removed through costly eradication efforts.
Oh, wow. That's a huge obstacle for ecosystem recovery then. You get rid of the invader, but the disease lingers.
Precisely. It leaves a legacy of harm.
So we've covered the main processes of harm. But before we talk about famous examples like the common carp, let's just pause and ask, is simply demonstrating increased competition or predation pressure enough to define a true ecological impact? Is stress the same as impact?
The paper argues strongly that no, it is not. And this is a really important conceptual turning point, especially for managers trying to allocate resources.
Okay.
The review adopts what's known as the Gosselin definition. This provides a much more rigid, quantifiable measure. It states that an ecological impact must be associated with a quantifiable decline of biological and/or genetic diversity.
Quantifiable decline.
Yes, leading to a measurable loss of diversity or change in ecosystem functioning. You need hard, measurable evidence that the ecosystem itself is actually worse off, not just temporarily stressed.
So showing that native fish are eating slightly less isn't enough. You need to show the population is declining or the whole system function is changing.
Exactly. Measurable loss is the key.
And when those measurable losses become severe enough, the paper connects this issue to an even higher level concept, that of ecosystem collapse.
Yes, drawing on the Newton definition from just a few years ago, 2021. Collapse is defined as a severely degraded state resulting from a substantial, persistent loss of biodiversity or critical function.
Persistent loss.
That, crucially, cannot recover unaided within decades. It's a state shift. And the most severe fish invasions, like those that completely restructure an entire lake system, absolutely align with this definition. They push the system over a cliff, demanding immediate, probably aggressive intervention.
Okay, that definition really raises the stakes. Let's dive into a classic example then, the ultimate ecological engineer perhaps. The common carp, Saprinus carpio. The species is listed among the 100 of the world's worst invasive species, and it causes harm in a pretty unique way.
Yeah.
You use the term middle-out effects. What does that actually mean for how carp restructure an ecosystem?
It's a great term because it captures how they simultaneously attack the system from both the bottom up and the top down.
How does that work?
Well, when carp forage, they're not just sipping things off the surface. They're rooting around deep in the benthic sediment, the mud at the bottom. That's benthic foraging.
Okay.
This activity simultaneously alters bottom-up processes by stirring up nutrients from the sediment, increasing nutrient levels in the water, which fuels algal blooms, and increasing turbidity cloudiness.
Right, they muddy the waters. Literally.
Literally. And at the same time, they alter top-down processes by actively uprooting aquatic macrophytes, the rooted plants, which destroys critical habitat structure for other fish and invertebrates.
So they cloud the water and eliminate the very plants that help keep the water clear and provide habitat. It's a double whammy.
Precisely. The combined result is often a dramatic shift in lake-stable states. You go from clear, plant-dominated systems to turbid, algae-dominated pea soup systems.
Okay, and what's crucial here, according to the paper, is the quantitative evidence, right? Showing that the relationship between the amount of carp, their biomass, and the level of impact is highly nonlinear. They found a quantitative tipping point.
Yes, and that's the critical detail for anyone trying to manage carp. Where is that point? When does the system flip?
So what did the studies suggest?
Well, studies indicate that significant negative impacts, say on vegetation cover or waterfowl abundance, can start occurring at carp biomass levels as low as maybe 100 kilograms per hectare.
Okay, that doesn't sound like a huge amount.
No, but the really dramatic shift, that rapid non-linear collapse from clear water to turbid water, that seems to occur very quickly within a fairly narrow window, somewhere between about 174 and 300 kilograms per hectare.
So there's a threshold range where things suddenly go bad very fast.
Exactly. And knowing this threshold is powerful because it implies that even relatively small management reductions in carp biomass, if they push the density below that tipping point, could potentially result in major, sudden ecosystem improvements. You might get disproportionate benefits.
But, as always in ecology, context matters hugely. Ecological impacts are highly context-dependent. A bad actor in one place might behave completely differently, maybe even benignly somewhere else.
This is one of the most surprising and frankly fascinating findings discussed in the review. There's this counterexample from Lake Naivasha in Kenya.
Okay, what happened there?
Carp were introduced, as they have been in many places. But in the initial years, researchers observed they actually led to an increase in native aquatic plants.
An increase? How is that possible?
It seems counterintuitive, right? The reason was that the carp were predating heavily on another pre-existing invasive species in the lake, the Louisiana red swamp crayfish, Procambarus clarkii.
Ah, the crayfish.
Yeah, and that crayfish had been aggressively mowing down the native macrophytes. So the invasive carp, by eating the invasive crayfish, indirectly helped the native plants recover, at least temporarily.
Wow, an invasive fish temporarily mitigating the impact of an invasive crustacean. That just underscores how incredibly complex management and prediction really are. You can't assume anything.
Not at all. Context is everything.
Now, let's shift focus slightly but completely. The paper highlights another really critical finding. Significant ecological impacts can arise even from species that are taxonomically native to a region or country.
Yes, this really challenges the traditional, maybe simplistic definition of an invasive threat being strictly something non-native from another continent, say.
So how does that work?
The research they synthesized compared the global impacts of what they term native introductions. A prime example is when massive numbers of hatchery-reared fish are released into wild populations of the same species, often for fishery enhancement.
Stocking programs, basically.
Exactly. And they found that, perhaps surprisingly, the negative impacts of these native introductions sometimes actually exceeded the impacts caused by completely non-native invaders.
Why would stocking fish that are already technically there cause a greater negative impact than introducing a totally foreign fish?
It often boils down to two main reasons. First, genetic effects. Stocking can swamp the local gene pool, causing a loss of basin-specific, locally adapted genetic traits and integrity. It homogenizes the population.
Okay, genetic pollution.
Right. And second, simply by drastically enhancing local population abundance. If you suddenly flood an ecosystem with hundreds of thousands of fish of the same species, even if native, they are perfectly ecologically suited to compete intensely with the existing wild population for food, space, everything.
So they might outcompete their wild counterparts just through sheer numbers, causing a greater measurable ecological impact than a foreign fish that might struggle initially to adapt.
Precisely. The native status doesn't automatically mean no impact, especially at high densities or with genetic mixing.
Okay, so putting all this together then, what does this synthesis tell us about how we should approach management? What's the real utility of defining impact so rigidly using those Gosselin and Newton definitions we talked about?
Well, I think the utility is primarily about clarity and prioritization. It forces a shift towards a quantified, risk-based approach.
Less guesswork, more data.
Exactly. The Gosselin definition gives us that clear framework for impact assessment. Are we actually seeing a measurable loss of diversity or function, yes or no? And then the Newton definition helps assess the severity. Does this level of degradation mean the system is effectively in a state of collapse, demanding immediate active intervention for any hope of recovery?
Right. It helps decide if we need to act and how urgently.
And the review does note that aggressive management can work in some cases. It references the successful eradication of carp from a specific South African reservoir using rotenone, a pesticide.
And what was the result?
Rapid, significant improvements in water clarity and macrophyte recovery, showing that active restoration is possible, at least when the environment is contained and the pressure is removed below that tipping point.
Okay, so there's hope in some situations.
Yes, and it's a big... But the limitation that the paper clearly acknowledges is the inherent difficulty of managing non-native fish, especially established ones, in large open systems. Think big rivers, interconnected lakes.
Much harder to control.
Immensely harder. Methods like chemical treatments, which might work well in a contained reservoir or small lake, are often non-species specific, killing native fish too, and they're basically impossible or ecologically catastrophic to apply effectively over vast river basins. That remains the major challenge for resource managers today.
So the take-home seems to be that the severity of ecological harm from invasive freshwater fish varies incredibly by the species, by the specific environmental context, and often critically by the invader's population density. It really requires sophisticated, quantified assessment. It's clear we need to be watching the whole system, not just focusing narrowly on the fish we happen to introduce or find.
Absolutely. And that actually leads perfectly into a final provocative thought for you, the listener, drawing directly from the source material. The paper highlights the existence of what are called sleeper populations. These are introduced populations that can remain at low abundance, maybe for decades, with relatively low ecological impact.
Lying low.
Exactly. Until some environmental trigger, a flood, a heat wave, a change in nutrient levels causes a sudden development of a highly abundant and disruptive population. They wake up.
The silent threat, just waiting for the right moment, the right conditions.
Precisely. So the question for you to ponder is this. What unforeseen, maybe subtle environmental changes happening right now in our freshwater systems, perhaps due to creeping shifts in temperature from climate change, altered river flows, gradual nutrient loading, are quietly setting the stage? Which of these currently inconspicuous sleeper populations might be accumulating risk, building towards an unknown future tipping point, and potentially an abrupt ecosystem collapse that we haven't even begun to seriously worry about yet?
That's a sobering thought.
It is. And that's perhaps the hidden management challenge of the next few decades, identifying and maybe mitigating those triggers before the sleepers wake up.